I am Global Managing Director of Client Strategy at The Economist. And one of the things that I do in that is spend a lot of time out talking to our clients, advertisers, marketeers. And over the last year, those conversations have all tended towards talking about millennials. I tend to go in and say, you know, what's on your mind, what keeps you awake at night to our clients, and they will say, well, we're worried about how we engage with millennials. That's might seem to be a slightly difficult conversation to be had with someone from The Economist, because the sort of background to that, or context to that is, well, you can't really help me with that from The Economist because you're not really a millennial brand. Maybe I should get Shane Smith from Vice to come in and talk to me about that. Do you know him? Can you bring him in? And so that created a bit of an interesting challenge for us, is that we do believe that we have something to say about millennials, but I wanted to put that in some context. So we decided in the face of that we would go out and do some research about millennials to try and understand, both for our own purposes, whether we were relevant as a brand to millennials, but also so that we could have a more engaged conversation with our clients. And the first thing that we found when we went to, you know, everybody starts research, even the venerable Economist starts research with Google these days. And the first thing that we found when we started to think about researching millennials is the standard cliches that everybody throws out about this generation. And every generation, there are some cliches that sort of, you know, frame the discussion. But for millennials, those cliches that we've all heard are particularly negative. Millennials are lazy, entitled, narcissistic, screwed, totally obsessed with social media, and totally disengaged. And of course, like any generation, there is an element of some truth in that, but that is not a fair representation, as I'm sure we all know, of the millennial generation. So we decided we needed to dig deeper. And we needed to dig deeper, particularly because when we looked at our own business, we found that our experience of engaging with millennials was not consistent at all with those cliches. And I'll give you two examples of that, which you might find surprising. The first is, we have about 1.5 million subscribers to The Economist around the world. And we look very closely, because we get a lot of data about who those people are. And in terms of new acquisitions to The Economist, new subscribers, the single biggest group that we have are millennials. So of all the new subscribers to The Economist last year, if you segmented them by generation, the biggest number of them came from the millennial generation. Interestingly enough, and sort of building on that last presentation, what's also interesting is disproportionately they take print subscriptions to The Economist, which kind of goes against this idea that the millennial generation is just digital. Secondly, and this probably is less surprising, The Economist has had huge success in social media. It's growing exponentially for us. I think we're the third biggest magazine brand in total on social. And again, that is being driven, when you look at the profiles of those people who are liking us on Facebook or following us on Twitter, is disproportionately being driven by the millennial generation. So the cliches that abound didn't sort of fit with our own experiences. So we decided, as you do, to do some more detailed research. And that research started with two sort of underlying hypotheses. One, that not all millennials are the same. Like any generation that's gone before, it is overly simplistic to try and generalize, particularly when you use such negative stereotypes. And secondly, that actually traditional media brands do still play a role in their lives, albeit potentially quite different to previous generations. So how did that research work? Well, there were two elements to it. It was a global piece of research. To avoid sort of the bias that this is something that was self-serving, we worked with a partner, Blunden worldwide, and we did two pieces of research. One was a quantitative study of about 90,000 people around the world, and the second was a qualitative piece of research that took that quantitative data and explored it in a bit more detail. I said it was global. I think it's really important when you're talking about a generation to be able to look at differences and similarities across markets. And as you'll see, we did a reasonably good job of engaging people across not just the US and UK, but in South America, in continental Europe, and in Asia. So we believe it's statistically significant and pretty robust. Now, the first thing that we found when we looked top line at all of this data was something that runs against the stereotypes, but might not surprise the people in this room, which is that when you look at the millennial generation as a whole, based on this research, you find that they are incredibly engaged in the consumption of online news, which goes against this stereotypical not interested in the world, lazy, narcissistic. In addition to be very involved in the consumption of online news, they are also extremely passionate about participating. So if you measure the millennial generation against other generations, they consume more news online than other generations and they participate more in it. And to be honest, that's interesting but not particularly groundbreaking. So we decided that we needed to look at the data in a different way. We need to segment it in a different way and have a look at psychographics. I apologize about the formatting on that slide. We needed to look at the psychographic breakdown of this audience. So what we did is we recut the data looking at things like opinions, behaviors, values, interests, attitudes and activities. And what became obvious to us when we did that was that there was a really particular sub-segment of this generation that we wanted to focus on. So we took all of the millennials, the 90,000, we drove into the data, we sub-segmented them. And we found that there was one particular segment that was particularly interesting to us. And this segment of millennials was defined by their topics of interest. They were particularly interested in technology, politics, business, finance, and environment. And as you can imagine, from the Economist point of view, that's why they were interesting to us. They were also interesting, though, because they had this extraordinary ability to influence. And that was they were particularly passionate about influencing and particularly effective at doing it. And thirdly, they had the ability to share. They were very efficient and effective at sharing. And in order to sort of frame this particular subsegment, we gave them a name. And that name, and you can tell what we did here, is the Gen-Narrators. So what I want to do now is just talk to you a little bit about this subsegment, because I think it is a large group of people on a global basis, and they are particularly interesting in and of themselves, but also interesting is this is the group that disproves all the other cliches that you have heard about millennials as a whole. So just to frame this, when we think about millennials, and it's a huge generation, as you all know, when we think about millennials, how big is this generator subsegment? Well, the segments that we found, there were 3 of them. Generators, as you can see up there, is the middle segment. And we found that nearly 1/3 of all millennials fall in what we termed the generator segment. Like every generation, there's people on the, as you look at it, left-hand side, the amplifiers, the 1%. And of course, in the digital world, they have huge power and are very interesting. At the other end, there's the followers, 70% of the millennial generation. But generators, these specialists, these people who have interest networks, these people who pay in knowledge rather than in cash, are particularly interesting. So 1 in 3 of the whole millennial generation fit this description of generators. Just to give you a sense of how that compares to other generations, because I think this is interesting, if you hold that definition steady, generators are people of influence who are able to exercise that influence through sharing, there are more generators or more influencers in the millennial generation than any generation that's gone before. And I think that makes this hugely interesting. In Generation X, only 1 in 5, broadly, fell under this category, and in the boomer generation, it was only just over 1 in 10. So that is interesting about the ability of this subsegment to really move the needle around particular conversations that they're passionate about. Now, the portrayal of millennials, as I said, the common portrayal, the stereotypes are they're lazy, narcissistic, entitled, apathetic, and social media obsessed. Looking at this subsegment, again, 1 in 3 of millennials that we found were generators, and this subsegment, in contrast, are active, interested, entrepreneurial, they're activists, and they're extraordinarily sophisticated and intelligent media connoisseurs. So let me just dive into that in a little bit of detail and unpack that for you. So I talked about when we looked at millennials as a whole, we found that they consume more online media, more online news media than any other generation that went before them. This subsegment of them, the generators, consume even more online news than millennials as a whole, and therefore even more online news than Generation X and baby boomers. Good for our business. They also consume more online news, are more interested, more passionate, more participatory in the news agenda online than influencers of any other generation that's gone before them. So if you just normalize that out and say, well, let's just look at the influencers within the millennial generation, within Generation X and baby boomers, you find the same thing. Extraordinarily passionate and active around news, particularly online. What's interesting, though, for me, is they are equally as interested and active in conversations around brands. So we have this, again, stereotypical view of millennials that they are anti-marketing, that they somehow have rebelled and rejected against advertising. And there is an element of truth in that. But actually, if you look at the data, particularly this subsegment of them, the generators, they are very willing and active to engage with brands in the right context. And I'll talk a bit more about what that context is shortly. So when we looked at this subsegment, the generators, we found 4 standout traits, which I just want to share with you because I think these are both interesting and insightful and potentially quite actionable. So we found that they're fact finders, we found that they're cultural DJs, we found that they're very sophisticated personal brand managers, and not surprisingly, given the focus of this study, we found that they are very effective, influential advocates. So what do I mean by fact finders? Well, this goes to the idea, or the stereotypical idea, that traditional media brands are not relevant to millennials. They certainly remain relevant to the generator subsegment, who use traditional media brands to validate the credibility of information. They trust traditional media brands for an unbiased perspective. They instantly check traditional media when something big happens, and they actively seek the truth. These are people who are sophisticated enough in their media consumption habits to understand that there is a way of using media to try and get to something that looks like the truth. So we very specifically asked this group of people what their most trusted media sources were, and 78% of the answers that came back could be considered to be traditional media. That doesn't mean that they don't trust newer forms of digital media. It just means that there is a balance here, there is a mix, that traditional media forms like CNN, like the BBC, like the FT and the Economist actually do very well with this influencer subsegment of the millennial audience. And actually, if you think about that, you see that at play when big things happen in the news cycle, the Charlie Hebdo attacks being one particular example, but you can think of any of the major news stories that have happened over the last few years. You see this in action. You see social media being extraordinarily important in the sharing of information about these substantial news events. But you also see the flows of behavior, the flows of generators, the millennial generation, going back and forth between social media and traditional media, sometimes in online form, in that kind of constant cycle of fact-checking of what's going on. And you can just look at the inflows and outflows of the digital properties of traditional media companies to see that happening. And again, we have in this research, and there's a much more detailed deck available, we have lots of anecdotal evidence to support that. There's a quote here, I saw a few videos pop up on Facebook, however I did turn to the TV for more information. And that's a very natural and quite sophisticated habit for people of this particular generation and this particular segment. Now, I talked about the second thing we found, they're cultural DJs. What do I mean by cultural DJs? It's a nice soundbite, very tweetable, that's good. Well, what I mean by that is that generators in particular, and this is true of millennials as a whole, but generators, this subsegment, are particularly fond of doing this, remix content to give it their own twist. I talked about the fact that this is a very participatory generation, and this is what's happening here. It's remixing, it's cultural DJing, and they particularly, and this came out in the previous presentation, do that through visual media. So visual media are hugely important to this generation when it comes to storytelling. And they very actively think of themselves as content curators, not just content consumers. Again, what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you an example that may be familiar with some of you in the audience. I don't mean to dwell too much on politics, but I am from The Economist after all. If you cast your minds back to the last election, a lot of political advertising going on. One of the Conservative Party's more memorable pieces of advertising or marketing was around this idea of the road to a stronger economy. Whether you are of a conservative persuasion or not, it was an interesting piece of marketing. Let's stay on the road to a stronger economy. Clearly did not resonate with everybody in the millennial generation, because very quickly you start to see this cultural DJing, this curation take off. This happened within minutes of that marketing campaign going live. And as you can see, Road to Ruin, the hashtag started to trend. People started to get onto this meme. They started visually to remix this content to give their own perspective on a piece of advertising. Again, we have a big case study about how this worked, and it's really interesting to follow the Road to Ruin hashtag and see how the different memes and sub-memes started to play out. But it's a great example of this kind of cultural DJing. The third thing I just wanted to draw on is that generators are personal brand managers. Now, I would argue that this subsegment of the millennial generation are natural-born marketeers. They have grown up being exposed to digital media and particularly social media. And if you think about it, the time you spend on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram or on Snapchat is really a branding exercise. I think we all recognize that those people that we're particularly friendly with on those chat platforms are showing a particular slice of their life. And that's all about branding. It's personal branding, but it's branding no less. And this is why I believe that this generation are more sophisticated marketeers, both when it comes to their own brands and to the marketing of brands that they consume than any generation that's gone before. And they take the idea of personal branding extremely seriously. And this is something that's very intrinsic. If you look at the anecdotal research or the qualitative research and look at some of the quotes that we got back, this is consistent in every single market around the world. Tamara says, I share my opinions and interests pretty readily, but do so knowing that I am influencing and sharing my own personal brand. Russell in the US says, sharing good content helps you to be better positioned, brackets personal branding in your sector as a reference. They talk about, very naturally, this idea of personal branding. Now, that, as I say, is not particularly surprising given they have grown up so exposed to digital media. And if you look at the stats, if you look at the quantitative side of this research, you see that generators, more than millennials and more than any other generation that's gone before them, have this very strong sense of how important the internet and digital channels are in building brands, as brand building tools. Now, the final thing that I just wanted to share before I sort of draw this together with some conclusions is that this generator subsegment, again, 1 in 3 of all millennials, is this huge generation. And I think, as you all know, millennials are now the biggest generation in the workforce of any generation. And by next year, we'll have the biggest spending power of any generation on the planet. So this is important. A third of those people who we class as generators are extremely influential advocates. So again, now, I think I've talked about this idea that the stereotypical view is that generators or millennials as a whole have kind of dismissed the whole idea of branding and brands and products. But clearly that's not the case. When you look at the research, we find that this generator subsegment are just as likely to use their influence to talk about brands that they love as they are to talk about passions around politics or economics or finance or the environment. So I think that is good news when you think about the potential of influencer marketing for this new generation. That said, authenticity is hugely important. And if you talk to someone like Ali, who said, for me, it's more about content. If you talk about a brand that's doing something really interesting in a campaign and that content is interesting, then I would share it. I think we've all talked, we all as media brands or all as marketeers thought, I wish I could get more people to share my content. How can I do that? Do I need to go and pay influencers? And I think the key takeout here is this has to be authentic. You talk to Joash in Asia, he says, I believe that it's important to support the brands that you trust and that you feel comfortable promoting. Authenticity is so important to this generation and particularly to this particular subset. So those are 4 things that we found about this particularly influential subsegment of millennials that we thought were interesting. So finally, I just wanted to leave you with what we took out of that and how we think it applies, or how you can apply those learnings. How do you harness those trends? The first thing, I think, is to make sure that you enable millennials as a whole, but particularly the influential subsegment of them, the generators, to build their own personal authority. They are such sophisticated brand marketeers of their own personal brands that they are looking to media companies and they're looking to brands to help build that own personal authority. They have big interest networks, and they, in their role as curators, use information provided by media companies and brands to build out their own personal authority. They have a real thirst for knowledge, and within that thirst for knowledge, there is a role that we can all play in building their authority. Secondly, is to provide opportunities for generators or millennials to participate. Now, they are very sophisticated in their understanding of how that participation works. They know about trolls, they know about flame wars. They are looking for, not necessarily safe, but certainly reasonably sophisticated environments in which they can share their opinions. I think we all see the world going to be or media to be a more participatory experience. It's difficult, it's hard to do, but for this generation, it's hugely important. Thirdly, if we're interested in harnessing influence and advocacy, I think we all have to remember that right at the heart of that for this generation is authenticity. We have to give people a reason to share, a valid reason to share, and a reason to recommend. And that reason is not usually, certainly for this subset of the generation, just about money. It's about appealing to passions, it's about storytelling, it's about authenticity. But the final thing that I'd like to leave you with, and I think this was as important to us when we started this research as when we ended it, given that our starting point was sort of to rebel against the stereotypes that had been used to define a whole generation. And that is the most important thing that I think we can all remember when we think about millennials, when we think about this research, when we think about how we change our businesses going forward. It is the most important thing to recognize is that not all millennials are the same. Generation X wasn't all the same, baby boomers weren't all the same. It is terribly easy to think of a whole generation in terms of these generalizations, but it's extremely dangerous. This generation, like every generation that's gone before it, includes clearly people who tend towards being lazy and narcissistic. Generation X did, baby boomers did. But this is also a generation with incredibly positive attributes. There are at least 1 in 3 of people in this generation fall under this tag that we've called Gen-Narrators. They are engaged, they're activists, they're passionate, they're extremely sophisticated, and we do a disservice to them if we think of them just in terms of stereotypes and generalizations. And I will leave you with a quote that came out of The Economist. We did a special report on the young in January, and the closing remarks in that was as follows. All generalizations about such a vast group, and they were talking about millennials, should be taken with a bucket of salt. What is true of young Chinese may not apply to young Americans or Burundians, but the young do have some things in common. They grew up in the age of smartphones and in the shadow of global financial disaster. They fret that it's hard to get a good education, a steady job, a home, and eventually a mate with whom to start a family. I think that's an interesting note on which to leave this because, of course, those things that they fret about in many ways are the same things that we all fretted about when we were the same age as them. So that's all from me. Delighted to take some questions if there are any, but thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure there'll be some questions. And I guess I'll kind of kick off really, which is you've given some ideas about how to engage with this audience of generators. What's The Economist wanting to do?
Yeah, I mean,
it's
a great question. We commissioned this research really to help us understand more about a particular generation, but it's had a huge and quite profound impact internally. We worked on it. It was research that was done in 2015. We believe it's still valid, but in 2015 we launched a number of initiatives that sort of played to this. The first was, whilst I talk about the fact that one doesn't want to generalize, clearly there is a large portion of the millennial generation who want to engage in online news, but you have to find, or in news digitally, but you have to find the ways to do that in a way that's relevant. So we launched our first mobile-only product, Economist Expresso, which is a daily view of The Economist in much shorter chunks. Generally our stories are 1,000 to 1,500 words. Expresso is pieces that are 250 words, delivered first thing in the morning every day, smartphone only, because we recognise that the smartphone and the ability to deliver timely, shorter pieces of information is important for that generation. The second thing, we recognise that they are incredibly visual. So we launched Economist Films, which is a way of doing storytelling for The Economist, but in a much more visual way that works particularly well on social channels like Facebook.
Like short documentaries.
They are actually not that short, 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay.
Yeah, so we took the view that says longer form journalism still works. The power is in the story, not in the length. So they are series, 6 episodes in each series, but the episode length is 10 minutes each.
And is that free content or is
free content? Yeah.
So that is it's not directly monetized. It's
monetized through sponsorship.
Sponsorship.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Expresso is directly monetized. So the films is monetized through sponsorship, but the Expresso app is a paid app.
Yes.
And again, we believe that this audience is so passionate about the news that they are willing to pay for it in some shape or form.
Yeah. Are you also encouraging or planning to encourage that group to contribute content to your sort of like various media channels?
Yeah, I mean, we have always had, and this is not, I think, generationally specific for us, but we've always had a hugely vibrant community, both on Economist.com
Yes.
through the comments and other things that we do, debates and those kind of things, and on our social platforms. And I think that's been a hugely important part of engaging with this audience.
Yes.
And we look at that, and we are indeed looking for new ways that we can kind of amplify that
Yeah.
within the construct of what makes The Economist unique,
And
which is this,
yes.
which is a specific view on the world.
Yeah.
And we take a view on the world that there's lots and lots of information out there. What the world needs more of is analysis. So that's an,
Yes.
an interesting frame through which to look at participation.
Yeah, because it exists. You said you're sort of like, well, you've done the analysis, it's experts, and you don't necessarily want your readers or your users to contribute to that, but it's sort of maybe creating a separate stream of information.
Yeah, and there are a
they
lot
can
of experts
contribute to.
in that millennial generation, so we welcome them. And actually, we have a lot of them who are on our
Yes.
staff, so
Yeah.
that helps also.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, right. Some other questions. One quick one, sort of like, where you can find that special report.
Yeah, it's on Economist.com. There's a section on Economist.com called Special Reports. You can also search for it on Google, clearly, if you just put Economist Special Report, The Young, which was the name of it.
Yes.
And it's made up of about 6-7 different pieces that were all in that special report. So Economist.com is a good place to find that.
Yeah. And quick question about whether you're using Snapchat as part of your social media.
Not yet.
No.
And
okay.
the reason we use Instagram, we use Line, we use a lot of platforms, we haven't quite found yet the right way to use Snapchat within our business. That's not to say we won't use it.
No.
But I think the interesting thing for us, and we feel very passionately about this, is there are some wonderful platform opportunities out there. Snapchat is a great platform. But I think you have to find the way of representing your brand and your journalism properly on a platform before you commit to it.
Yes, yeah. And then kind of linked to that, whether you're going to share your research report or kind of how
Yeah,
is that on the website as well?
It is on, we have a website called Marketing Unbound, which is a sort of thought leadership website. It's available there. I will also post a link to it on Twitter after this.
Yeah.
After we finish today, I'm at Nick Blunden on Twitter, so I'm happy to share both that shortened deck, which was
Yes.
the sort of summary. There is a 130 slide deck, which has a lot more of the sort of verbatim
And that's what went
comments.
into the FIPP Insight Awards, I guess.
Yes, it did,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, yeah. Okay, brilliant. Any questions from the floor? No? Okay, well, thank you very much for
It's an absolute pleasure.
really
Thank you for having
great
me.
presentation. So thank you very much.
Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot.
Cheers.